I will say this over and over and over again. Domestic violence injunction is just this. A protection order is just this. It's a piece of paper. It's never going to keep any woman safe when somebody is hell-bent to kill you. And clearly, this guy was hell-bent on killing her.
A Florida teenager comes home to find her mother murdered, shot dead by this woman's estranged husband. But just days earlier, he'd been arrested allegedly for attacking her and posted bond and was back on the streets. How did this happen, and could it have been prevented? Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Let's go back to Monday, March 31st, just past 2 in the morning out in Deltona. This is a suburban community in Volusia County, Florida. A teenager returns home and finds an unimaginable horror scene. Her mother dead on the floor. 38-year-old Ashley Vaia, a mother of 3, was lying there lifeless, dead from apparent gunshot wounds. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine how much of a nightmare that is for this daughter. And the man authorities say was responsible for Ashley's death, her 33-year-old estranged husband, Samuel Vaia, who apparently fled the scene, was apprehended. But here's the thing, ultimately couldn't be saved from what authorities say was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He died. Now that might be where this story ends, but it's not where it begins. Because it turns out just a week or so before this terrible tragedy, authorities arrested Samuel in a domestic violence incident. This was back on March 23rd for allegedly cornering Ashley inside the bedroom of her home over suspicions that she was cheating. And Ashley's 19-year-old daughter, the same teenager who found her dead, she was the one who actually saved her a week earlier, rushing into the room and, quote, spooking Samuel away. Deputies ended up responding at nearly 2 a.m. Samuel was arrested. He was booked on a battery charge, but unfortunately, he was able to post that $2,000 bond, return to the streets, and eventually return to Ashley's home to commit the unthinkable. Now, before we go any further into the story, I want to bring on a special guest here on Sidebar, help break all this down. I'm joined by police sergeant and host of the podcast, Shots Fired, Kyle Shoberg. Kyle, thanks so much for coming back here on the show. Just your overall thoughts on this case before we get into more of the specifics.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you look at this is a despicable crime. And the fact that her daughter found her, that makes it even worse. And it is sad to say that oftentimes in these domestic violence types of cases, they do turn out to be lethal. And so there are red flags and signs that you constantly have to evaluate and look for in law enforcement to try to protect the victims of domestic violence. And in this case, unfortunately, she could not be saved, even though he was arrested. There was a restraining order against him. Ultimately, he ended up taking her life, led police on a chase, and took his own life. So the whole thing is just sad.
By the way, given that he was arrested for domestic battery just days before the murder, obviously they didn't know this was going to happen, but what are the factors that go into whether a suspect will be held without bond in such cases? I mean, obviously 2020, going back looking at what happened, but is $2,000 bond appropriate in a case like this?
Well, I think you got to take a look at the charges. So in looking at his booking document, it looks like he was booked for a misdemeanor domestic violence charge. And so you have 2 different types of domestic violence charges. You have a felony, which would be visible injury to the victim. And then you have a misdemeanor, which could be, hey, he pushed me, he threw me to the ground, but there's no visible injury. That person would then still be arrested but charged for a misdemeanor. And it looks like that's what he was charged with in this case. And so $2,000 is a low dollar amount to bail out. They did get, it looks like, a restraining order against him, against Ashley. So he was supposed to have no contact with her, but at the end of the day, like we tell all these victims, that is just a piece of paper. And so you do have to take necessary steps to protect yourself and your family.
Hey, I just want to take a quick sidebar from Sidebar to thank Odoo for sponsoring this episode. And here's the thing, Odoo, an incredible all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications like their Projects app. And we know managing projects can be tough, but with Odoo Projects app, it doesn't have to be. You need a clear timeline? The Gantt view helps map out your tasks, helps you stay on track. Prefer a more flexible approach? The Kanban view lets you move tasks easily from to-do to done. And if you like structure, the list view gives you all the details at a glance. Plus, Odoo's comprehensive dashboard keeps you updated on task status, activities, remaining time, so you're always in control. And with powerful reporting tools, you can track your project's budget, milestones, profitability in real time. The Odoo Projects app helps you stay organized, meet deadlines, and boost productivity. So right now, you can get a free 15-day trial of Odoo's all-in-one business solution. Scan the QR code on screen or check it out at our link, odoo.com/sidebarproject. And just to be clear, if anybody's unfamiliar with this, there's nothing that police do, right? They don't just like watch him and watch his movements moving forward. There's nothing that police actively do afterwards or any protocols put in place to make sure he abides by the court order, right?
Correct. And here in the state of California, you are mandated at the jail to contact the victim and let the victim know, hey, your abuser is bailing out of jail or he will be released from custody, giving them a heads up that this person is going to be released from custody. So if they do need to take necessary steps to either leave the location that they're at, find a different place to stay. And I would venture to guess every law enforcement agency has this protocol in place where we do offer victims what we call a safe house. And if they need to go to this safe house, absolutely nobody knows where this house is. Oftentimes law enforcement officers don't even know where this house is. We would get them hooked up with advocates. They would then take them to this safe house where nobody would know where they're at other than the advocate and then the victim. And so I'm not sure if this was offered to her. I would imagine it is. The sad thing is most of the time when you offer these things to victims, they deny it because they don't want to think that their abuser would get out of jail and harm them again. Domestic violence situations are really tricky because you're talking about emotions in these. And so when you play with emotions and people's relationships, that affects those decisions a lot of the time.
And it affects family too. I mean, one of the idea that this daughter found her mother dead, but the idea that this daughter also jumped in, and we're going to get into more specifics of what happened, but how often, generally speaking, do you see bystanders or family members jump in to deter these incidents of domestic violence? Does it happen a lot?
Yeah, honestly, Jesse, most of the time, kids get involved in these. And look, I grew up in a domestic violence household where my dad abused my mom, and me and my sisters would have to run to the neighbors and call the cops on my own father. And so I totally understand that type of dynamic. And so being a law enforcement, going to these calls a lot, I mean, daily, oftentimes it is kids that interject into these situations and either have to call the cops themselves or, a lot of times it's really sad, but these kids will even fight off their own parents who are abusing, whether it's dad or mom, and directly get themselves involved. And so believe it or not, yes, this happens more times than not.
Yeah, it's a really unfortunate situation. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I want to take a step back though, and I want to talk about this more. So let's go back now to that first domestic violence incident. So on the morning of Sunday, March 23rd, deputies from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, they responded to a domestic disturbance reported at Ashley's home. And according to the charging affidavit that was obtained by Law&Crime, Ashley told police that she and her ex-husband Samuel had been divorced for a little over a year, but the two were trying to rekindle their relationship, trying to maybe see if they could work things out. They were seeing each other on again, off again. But in this particular incident, Ashley told officers that Samuel, who had a key to her home, walked into the master bedroom, grabbed her cell phone off the bedside table, and began trying to get into her phone to see if she was cheating on him. And when she attempted to retrieve the phone, it fell to the floor, and that's when things reportedly became physical. According to the affidavit, Ashley stated Samuel then grabbed her by her shoulders and began pushing her into the master bathroom and closing the door behind them once they were both inside. Ashley explained she was telling Samuel to stop and let me out while he continued to berate her about infidelity accusations. Ashley stated she attempted to yell and tell her phone to call 911, but again was unsuccessful. Ashley advised that when she began yelling for him to let her out of the bathroom, Samuel covered her mouth for a few seconds and said, "Stop lying to me and tell me the truth." Ashley then told deputies that is when she began calling for her daughter, who was sleeping on the other side of the house. And it was only when Ashley called out for her daughter that Samuel abruptly fled the scene. Ashley told police that Samuel had a weapon, a firearm, on him, and when authorities tracked him down at his father's home, that interaction, captured on body-worn camera footage, shows officers confiscating a firearm that he had tucked into his waistband. In fact, take a look at this footage and what Sheriff Michael Chitwood of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office had to say about that incident during a media briefing.
We arrive on scene, they tell us who he is. He's a couple doors away at his dad's house. When deputies take him into custody, he's armed with the firearm. That's 323, and he's arrested for battery and domestic violence.
So according to court records, he was charged with a battery count, a first-degree misdemeanor, as we talked about. 3 days later, March 24th, he posted bond, set at just $2,000. Again, he was out there to walk free. Kyle, when you look at this, the affidavit states that Samuel entered Ashley's home with a key during their, attempted reconciliation. How did deputies advise victims in on-again, off-again relationships to secure their homes, to stay safe in situations like this?
Yeah, well, it goes back to, again, just letting victims know, hey, try to, if this sounds like a volatile situation, get cameras, get new locks for your house. The problem is if she gave him a key to the house and he's been actively coming and going from that residence because they're trying to rekindle their relationship, makes things a little bit more tricky if she's giving him permission to come over. Now, if he just showed up at her house uninvited, walks inside, assaults her like that, then you're talking about here in California, you could be charged with felony burglary charge, assault, all sorts of things, especially if he had a firearm on him. But the fact that he had that firearm confiscated when he was released from jail, because she got the restraining order, he was supposed to surrender all his firearms. Sounds like he surrendered 3. Obviously, he kept 1. And that's the other part of this is there really is no accountability for that. Just because we tell you you're supposed to surrender your firearms, we expect the people to actually do that. And so that also becomes very tricky because where's the accountability piece in making and ensuring that all firearms are actually turned over?
And I'm going to get to that in a second because you make a really, really good point. One of the scary aspects of this is that if her daughter wasn't there, look, we're dealing with a situation where she was killed regardless, but in another situation, if a family member isn't there, she couldn't get access to her phone. Are there other ways that, law enforcement advise people in these situations, another way to contact law enforcement? Are there other security apparatuses they can put in place at a home if maybe they don't have easy contact to their phone?
Well, there's not much else you could do other than maybe tell your neighbors, hey, if you see him come to my house, if you see his car here, please immediately contact law enforcement. He's not supposed to be here. And that actually happens. We'll have neighbors or someone call and say, hey, I just noticed that, this person showed up at this house. I understand they were just arrested for domestic violence, not supposed to be here. And sure enough, we show up and that is the case. And then we will end up arresting that person. So, you can take all the safety measures in the world you want. At the end of the day, if somebody wants to carry out a particular crime, they're going to find a way to do it. And unfortunately, if he took her phone and locked her in the bathroom, her options are pretty limited. And luckily that night her daughter was there. But like you said, ultimately this ends up in a tragic murder anyways.
So the day after Samuel posted bond, so this is now March 25th, as we were talking about, the court issued a no contact order commanding him to not only stay away from Ashley, but also, as we talked about, to surrender any firearms in his possession to the sheriff's office within 48 hours of receiving the order. But again, it turned out some of his firearms, he might have turned some of them in, but not all of them. Take a listen to what Sheriff Chitwood had to say about that.
The court issues an order for him to turn over all of his firearms to us. He turns, clearly not all of them in, he turns 3 of them in. And then you fast forward, to the 31st, and here we have a mother of 3, a 2-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 21-year-old who is basically executed. And, again, it goes back to, I will say this over and over and over again, domestic violence injunction is just this. A protection order is just this. It's a piece of paper. It's never going to keep any woman safe when somebody is hell-bent to kill you. And clearly, this guy was hell-bent on killing her.
And that's true. Vaia, it seemed, was exactly that hell-bent. Kyle, just going back to this, that 48 hours to surrender the firearms, is that a standard timeline? What verification process exists to confirm that all the firearms are surrendered? Talk to us about that.
Yes, that is true. You are supposed to surrender all of your firearms. And look, there is no accountability for that. If law enforcement takes it upon themselves to go to the dad's house, if that's where he lives, to confirm that he turned in all firearms, let's say we go there and we locate a firearm, well, then he would be charged with a new crime of being in possession of that weapon when he was supposed to turn it in. But at the end of the day, there is not a whole lot of accountability for that. The expectation is just that these people turn in their firearms. And I've never thought it made sense, because you take a guy like this who's hell-bent on hurting this girl. Why would we just expect these people to turn in all of their firearms? So
Yeah.
I've never even been a big fan of that. I've never liked that there is no accountability for it. And too often times things like this happen because of that.
And I want to get into that. I want to get into exactly what happened now on the day of this tragedy. So in the early morning hours of March 31st, Samuel made his way back to Ashley's home, and what transpired inside those walls may never really be fully known, but the outcome, we know. The outcome was devastating. Gunshots echoed throughout that house. Ashley, a mother of three, including a 2-year-old child that she shared with Samuel, she is now gone. And Ashley's 19-year-old daughter, who again was able to save her the first time, this time showed up too late. And she arrived home shortly after, discovered her mother's body. But here's the thing. Although she wasn't able to save her mom, and clearly this is not her fault at all, but her suspicion that Samuel may have been involved gave police a lead. And by the time deputies arrived at the scene after 2 in the morning, Samuel had already sped away in his vehicle, a white SUV. But the information from Ashley's daughter, coupled with what Samuel's father also told police, helped track them down, or track his vehicle down, chase him down. And here's what Sheriff Chitwood had to say about this lead and what was a high-stakes chase.
At 2:23 a.m., we received a call to come to 3203 Parma Avenue in Deltona. It was the victim's 19-year-old daughter on the phone saying that she had heard screaming, glass breaking, and gunshots, and she was locked in her bedroom. She was afraid to go out, but she believed that the perpetrator was the ex-husband of her mom, Samuel Vaia. And she also let us know that last week we had arrested him in possession of a firearm during a domestic dispute inside of the house. At that same time, we then get a phone call from the suspect's father, who lives up the street, and said, my son just left the house, told us that Ashley was shot. You know, he's in camo gear, he's got a bulletproof vest, he's got a long gun and a handgun on him. Deputies automatically entered the vehicle, which was a 2020 Range Rover, into the tag readers. At 2:47 a.m., there's a tag reader hit in Daytona on that vehicle. A few minutes later, Air 1 is up and picks up the vehicle on 95 northbound. Our sergeant gets behind the vehicle. In that pursuit was St. Johns County, Daytona Beach Police Department, FHP, us, and Flagler. When they get up to 5000 Parkway, Palm Coast Parkway up there, Hammock Dunes Parkway, wherever it is, the vehicle rolls over. And then there's a standoff. He's inside of the vehicle. Flagler SWAT team is out there, and I think it's a 3:21 is when the rollover occurs. You know he's armed and he has body armor. SWAT team gets out there. They make announcements. Drones are flying. They decide to try to break into the windshield of the car, where then they observe that the suspect has a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Where he is subsequently pronounced dead on the scene.
So for nearly 2 hours, law enforcement waited in this standoff, trying to negotiate with Samuel. They actually ended up apprehending him, even taking him to the hospital, but he succumbed to his self-inflicted injury. Kyle, you know, this vehicle pursuit, this standoff, talk to us about what goes into this, what officers, how they prepare for this, and because this is a really high-stakes situation, and clearly it resulted in him dying and taking his own life. But talk to us about how officers prepare for it and what we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, look, I was just in a vehicle pursuit yesterday with a guy armed with a firearm who had committed a violent crime and ended up in the same circumstance, crashed his car, and we had to have the SWAT team come out, and he barricaded himself inside the vehicle. And so it just goes back to you never know what you're dealing with or who you're dealing with. What are they armed with? And in this case, he's wanted for murder. And going back, he talked about, he put the license plate in the tag reader. He's talking about a license plate reader. And most cities around now have that type of technology. And so as soon as that license plate hits one of those license plate readers, dispatch, officers, everybody gets notified of exactly where the vehicle's at. And that's how they were able to locate him. But as far as the pursuit goes, I mean, when you're in a car chase with a violent person who's armed, it is scary and it's intense. And a lot of things go into play. How is this going to play out? To me, the most scary part of a pursuit isn't during the chase. It's what happens when the chase comes to an end. Yeah. Because now something is going to happen. This person's either going to surrender, they're going to get out and run, or they're going to fight it out. And so you don't know. And you got to be mentally prepared for that. And while you're doing these car chases, you're getting a lot of resources put in place. You're communicating with other officers. I mean, there's a lot going on inside that car for things that need to get done to make this thing come to an end at some point. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, what are some of those tactics police use?
Yeah, I mean, you could pit this vehicle, which means you would spin it out of control and get the engine to shut off. That's the whole purpose of that. You could set up spike strips, tactically try to get people in place to be able to throw spike strips out to pop the tires, get that thing to come to an end. In a case like this, depending on how fast this guy is driving, and if you had access to an armored vehicle, we would get armored vehicles up there and try to pinch that car in while he's driving so that he wouldn't be able to move anymore. And so in this case, he ends up rolling the car on his own. And now you're definitely not going to approach that vehicle. You should not be approaching that vehicle. You should stay behind cover, use your cars as cover, order him out of the car. And if he can't get out of the vehicle because maybe he's injured, then you still aren't going to risk your safety to approach the vehicle. You're going to wait for, maybe we would use drones to fly in that car and see what is his demeanor. Is he actually injured? Is he unconscious? All of those things. And so that's why we have SWAT teams come out. We use armored vehicles. We have a lot of technology nowadays to protect officers. And so that's exactly what they did in this case. And sometimes when you hear 2 hours, that sounds like a long time. And in yesterday's event, it did take us 2 hours because this guy was barricaded in a car with a firearm. We're sitting there trying to negotiate with these people. We don't want them to get hurt, and we don't want to get hurt. And we don't want the general public to get hurt. So if it takes 2 hours to negotiate with somebody, it might take 4 or 5 hours to negotiate with somebody. If we feel like we're gaining progress with that, we'll continue with that. Meanwhile, in the background, you have officers or tactical officers setting up maybe some type of plan in the background while negotiators are keeping the suspect occupied. And so at the end of the day, if these people flat out refuse to come out or surrender, obviously we're only going to give that so much time. That's when we would probably deploy gas or something in the vehicle to flush them out of the car.
Yeah, that's a really harrowing situation and rapidly developing. One of that's really interesting about this is, and I wanted your take on it, it's something that Sheriff Chitwood said. He mentioned it during his press briefing. He basically said that Florida doesn't have to wait for a warrant in cases like this. They just can take action. Let him tell you.
We do something different here that a lot of other people don't do. We don't wait for a warrant, okay? So if you get a call for domestic violence and the deputies get there and they establish probable cause, they do an affidavit and they automatically begin searching for that person.
So Kyle, that's so interesting. What do you think about that, man? Do you have something similar in California, this no-wait approach?
Yeah, absolutely. If a felony has occurred or some type of domestic violence incident has occurred, it's a mandatory arrest. And in something like that, yeah, we would actively go out and try to find that person. And if you can't, then you would submit a warrant for their arrest. Depending on how severe that crime was, in this case, when he ends up killing her, they're definitely going to start tracking him down immediately, and they're not going to stop until they find him.
So even a domestic violence situation
Yes.
where if you're talking about what happened a week prior, it balances with the Fourth Amendment, right? But the idea here, if you reasonably suspect a crime is being committed or an act of domestic violence, they don't have to wait for a warrant because I guess it's such a rapidly developing, violent situation, potentially violent situation with disastrous consequences.
Yeah, you just have to articulate that. Why would you go and continue to look for this person? Now, you do have what we would call a stale misdemeanor. So if it's a misdemeanor, not a felony, after so much time, if there's a break in the investigation, so you're working this case, you're trying to find this person, you can't find him, you move on to other calls, you can't then later come back and arrest that person and book him for a misdemeanor. So you have to keep that investigation ongoing in order to make that arrest here in California. If it's a felony, it's a different story. That doesn't, you can arrest him anytime. But anytime we go to a domestic violence call, it doesn't matter if it's 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. We'll take the report if the other party's gone because domestic violence situations are so volatile, and we will then actively go try to track that other person down and try to take them into custody to protect the victim.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you clarified that. Look, at the end of the day, what do we know? We know that Ashley's family now is devastated. They have to grapple with this unbearable loss. Flagler County Sheriff Rick Staley, whose office assisted with chasing down Samuel, also released a statement saying, "I'm thankful for the swift actions of our deputies in helping to prevent any further loss of life. This is a deeply tragic incident for all involved, and we send our condolences to the victim's family during this extremely difficult time." And the lingering question in all of this remains, could this have been prevented? Domestic violence is a real stain It is a terrible, terrible reality that is happening in this country, and it claims far too many lives. Ashley's death is just another heartbreaking example of what can happen if maybe warning signs go ignored. And then there's other times when there's not much more that can be done. But I'll tell you, for anybody suffering in silence, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office is urging victims to reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at the number you see there on your screen. Kyle Shoberg, thanks so much for taking the time. And as always, thank you so much for the work that you and your team do.
Thank you, guys. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.